It's not gay and lesbian so much, it's queer, pansexual, asexual, bisexual. These are the categories that have gone up a lot, and especially among women. It's all about stories of the good and the goodies and the baddies. And the cultural left has won the battle for hearts. They would get nowhere without the support of that big chunk of well-meaning left liberals. And if you kind of say anything that might be perceived as disrespectful or insensitive to groups at the top of the totemic hierarchy, you must be cast out. So the idea of if you offend the gods, you must be excluded from the community through cancellation. So there's very much a religious template.
We've got the left that no longer gives a damn about the working class. They openly detest them. We've got the conservatives that would struggle to pass for a wet lettuce liberal most of the time.
The way the cultural left operates is it will essentially deny there's a problem until the evidence is so overwhelming, and then they'll just suddenly pretend they never denied there was a problem. This whole hate speech, disinformation stuff is a big crusade of the woke anti-free speech left, and they're leaning into that. They're going to do something on as if there isn't enough brainwashing going on in the schools, but they want to even ramp it up even more.
You've done the report around the rise of wokeness, essentially, within the youth. So what have you found in terms of the link of the very left ideology and the rise in LGBT, for example, identification within the youth?
Yeah, this is a really difficult area. So I've done a number of different think tank reports. I mean, I've done 2 reports on radical race and gender ideology in schools. So these are both looking at 18 to 20-year-olds and what they've been taught in school. In the UK case, 6 concepts, most from critical race theory like white privilege and systemic racism. Some from radical feminism or gender ideologies such as the idea of many genders or patriarchy. What you see in Britain is something like 3/4 of 18 to 20-year-olds have heard at least one of these terms from an adult at school. In the US, it's 95%. The rate of penetration is very high. The other thing you see, particularly in the US case, is the more you've been exposed to these concepts, the more likely you are to hold woke beliefs, such as white guilt and belief that there should be reparations and affirmative action and these sorts of things on the grounds of race. That was particularly noticeable in the United States. Now, I've also done another think tank report looking at the LGBT surge among young people. That was with CSPI, where I'm a board member. And so what that showed, I mean, essentially the data shows something like a tripling in LGBT identification among under 30s from about 2008 to about 2021. So we're now, Gallup just reported 22% of Gen Z identify as something other than heterosexual as of 2023. And that's up from something like sort of 6-7%. I'm trying to remember the number in 2010. But other surveys show a sort of tripling. So what's behind this surge? And it's very difficult because we have 3 things are highly connected. That's mental illness, so saying you are anxious or depressed, identifying as far left, and identifying as not heterosexual. These things are highly correlated. And one of the tricky things is to try and figure out what is causing what, which is so increasingly my view is that, if you look at young people, the share that identify as being on the left in America, let's say, has not really increased very much. And yet the share with mental illness has shot up. The share that identify as not LGBT has shot up. And so the question then becomes, so what is actually going on? My view is actually that the rise in LGBT is relatively independent of both ideology and, to a large extent, independent of the mental health issue. Because what you've seen is that the share of, and it's particularly bisexuality, it's not gay and lesbian so much, it's queer, pansexual, asexual, bisexual. These are the categories. that have gone up a lot, and especially among women. So female bisexuality is what's really increased. When I say bisexuality, I mean by identification. Most of those female bisexuals have only had heterosexual, that is, male partners in the last 5 years. So what you're getting is an increasing number of women, but not just women, also men, but who have heterosexual, regular opposite sex attraction sex lives. They're not behaving in a way that is anything other than heterosexual, but they are identifying that way. And that's what we've got is a real change in identity. Not so much a behavior, which is still largely heterosexual, but the identity has moved heavily into these other categories. And that's got its own dynamic. And I think it's coming from the culture somehow. But that culture is resonating with certain groups, young people, women, people with mental illness, people on the far left. Those groups somehow are being disproportionately affected by this new culture.
That was something interesting, because when I was looking at the report, that there were a few potential inconsistencies that I could see. Like, I couldn't quite explain, for example, why is it that the personality types tend to predict the political beliefs. So if then the political beliefs then feed into the rise of wokeness in general, why do we see such a rise? Because that would then imply that somehow biology is involved, which would be quite difficult to explain. Do we actually see the wokeness within conservative youth?
Well, in some ways, yes, I think. I mean, you will find in the FIRE, the big 50,000 annual student survey conducted in the US by Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, you can see that even students identifying as conservative, a significant chunk of them support preventing certain kinds of speaker to come to campus to speak. So someone who says BLM is a hate group or transgender is a mental disorder, you'll still have a significant share of conservatives, particularly conservative women, who say that person shouldn't be allowed to speak on campus. So I would say that these woke attitudes have had some penetration amongst even conservatives, amongst young conservative people. But it's mainly, of course, those on the left where it's had the biggest impact. Yeah.
Okay. So earlier on, when you mentioned that the woke attitudes is a little bit more about identification than behavior, is that the case in all aspects of woke? Because we've got the sort of sexuality and the sexual behavior on one side, which, as you mentioned, the identification doesn't really match the real behavior or the real dating patterns. But your report certainly highlighted some of the issues when it comes to tolerance of beliefs other than your own, for example. So where are we at in terms of the real behavior and the identification?
Real behavior, certainly in terms of sexual behavior, that's not changed that much. But it's the identity that's changed a lot, but also the beliefs. So for example, the younger generation is a lot more morally absolutist. They believe in absolute right or wrong. If they have a university education, they're even more likely to believe that. And that completely upends an existing literature, which used to say that university education made people less fixed in their moral beliefs. They made them more relativistic, believe that there are relative values and different people believe different things. I mean, that was the literature really for 50 years. And then now we're seeing actually young people who go to university have got much more fixed moralistic beliefs. And really what that is it's moralism around the woke identity category. So I define woke, just for your listeners, as the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups, from which flows a sort of inductive philosophy that says equal outcomes and emotional harm protection or emotional safety for those minority groups is the highest value in society. And because a lot of young people essentially have taken on these beliefs, it's made them very intolerant of anybody who criticizes those beliefs or who says anything that might be perceived as offensive to even the most sensitive member of one of these groups. And so that's leading them to be very intolerant of different views around the sacred values. If it's not around the sacred values, then they're tolerant. But if it is around the sacred values, they're highly intolerant to the point of demanding people be, no platformed or canceled. And I don't want to broad brush and say it's all young people. It isn't. There's a split, and there's a strong split, right? But amongst a significant group, which on some surveys, I say, if you look at that student survey covering 200 top institutions in the US, 50,000, you're getting sort of 70 to 80%. You're only getting about 10 to 20% saying that somebody who says BLM is a hate group or trans is a mental disorder should be allowed to speak on campus. So you have a very large majority in the anti-free speech camp.
When you're talking about the strong split, is that strong in terms of the percentage of the strong opposition, or is it just that their views and attitudes are sort of becoming more and more polarized?
I think they are becoming polarized, and I'm trying to think of which questions. If you take a question like, should J.K. Rowling be dropped by her publisher in Britain? Anyone over 50, it's like under 5% basically who agree with that she should be dropped, canceled because of her views on the trans issue. Among young people who have an opinion, it's 50-50. But I think that so that gives you a sense of just what an earthquake is coming down the line. Now, there is a caveat, which is that polling of young people is notoriously tricky, and the ones who answer the polls are probably very disproportionately from that woke side of the ledger. But still, even with that in mind, I mean, clearly they are a more intolerant generation, and that's going to affect our free speech culture. But on the other hand, you have a very powerful anti-woke subculture too. It's more male, for example, among young people, and we're seeing things, I'm trying to think of some good examples. I mean, one might be the significant conservative voting in Canada, and even in the polls picking up in the US now, there's 40% Trump support. There was a poll done in Canada where half of the under 25s in Canada said they'd vote Trump. Now, this is in a country that has very intense woke indoctrination in all its institutions. So I think there is definitely a sort of significant resistance to the dominant culture amongst young people. And so what we see is there's a bigger spread of views among younger people on a lot of culture war issues. And so that would tell us there's probably going to be polarization, a more intense polarization on these questions in like 20 years when the median voter is a Zoomer, or a millennial.
So some of the hopes of the conservative voices that we are sort of past the peak woke, you are not buying into that then?
Yeah, so this idea is that some people like to say, oh, woke is a fad, this idea of cancel culture and attacks on the past and renaming things. All of this is just a temporary fad. It's a blip like McCarthyism. It's going to be gone. I think that's hopelessly naive. What we see is, in fact, we're in the third wave of what I would call cultural socialist awakening. The first wave was in the late 1960s when we saw the first cancellations, by the way, and we saw a push for affirmative action quotas. Then in the late 80s and early 90s, when I went to university, we saw the second wave, which was all about political correctness, speech codes, minority self-esteem, Western civilization, dead white males has to go. All of that stuff was happening in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, at that time, there was an interview on a major U.S. news program called the McNeil-Lehrer NewsHour, where They were Dinesh D'Souza, conservative, was being interviewed. He's a young man at the time, by Robert McNeil, who said, well, people are making fun of political correctness and the excesses in the newspapers. This is on its way out. No one's going to remember this. And D'Souza said, well, no, it's because it's become part of the establishment. It's become institutionalized. It's not going to go away. And he was right, actually, because in the mid-2010s, it came roaring back, bigger than ever. And actually, in between the second wave and the third wave, actually, you could see significant activity. You could see every so often there would be a cancellation. There would be, I just remember a case from the mid-90s. I'm from Vancouver, Canada. The local university, UBC, the political science department was paralyzed with random accusations of racism and sexism, not pointed at any one individual, not substantiated in any way. It led to hundreds of thousands of dollars being spent on some outside investigator. The whole thing was a complete joke, and yet it shows there was no resistance to this virus even then. It's just that the people that were pushing the ideology didn't have the numbers. They didn't have social media with the like button to create a Twitter mob, to organize people across the world to get behind these mobbings. So you didn't have the technology, perhaps, to spread this stuff. The other thing you didn't have was a news media that ran on clicks. So when you have a click-driven, eyeball-driven news model instead of a classified ads news model, and the need to go viral on social media, I mean, that really helped to explode this phenomenon. So it wasn't just people taking gender studies, which was always crazy and had been crazy for decades. All of a sudden, these ideas spread off campus through the new online media and social media and affected a much larger swathe of society. And so the distinct thing about our current wave, yes, there's trans, which is new, but pretty much everything else is just a deepening and extension of ideas that were already there going back to the late 60s.
I think what's so interesting, and I love your definition of woke, because a lot of people sort of use it and we all know what we mean, but describing it succinctly is actually quite difficult. So it's a nice, really elegant definition. The bit that I find particularly interesting is that the same people that subscribe very passionately to the woke ideology are also not particularly religious. How is it that the same people are able to take these crazy ideas and run with them with the same sort of zealousy as some of your very, very radical, religious sort of figures, even from the past inquisitions? Do you actually believe that for those people it is like a replacement of a religion? Or how do you understand that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, there's no question it is a religion in the Emil Durkheim sense of sacred and profane, binding a community together with rituals. You think about taking the knee, jazz hands, something like the progressive stack or the privilege walk. You have these different rituals which are clearly signaling membership. You have these sacred values if you transgress. So if you say anything that might offend a sacred totem, so you have the totemic sacred groups, say Black or Indigenous at the top, and then you have gay or LGBT and trans a little further down, and white male at the bottom of this totem pole of oppressor versus oppressed in terms of oppression points. And if you kind of say anything that might be perceived as disrespectful or insensitive to groups at the top of the totemic hierarchy, something like "you're so articulate" to a Black person, that's that could be interpreted as suggesting most Black people aren't articulate, therefore you're a racist, therefore you must be cast out. So the idea of if you offend the gods, you must be excluded from the community through cancellation. So there's very much a religious template. And John McWhorter is perhaps the best on this, but a number of others. Joshua Mitchell's book, American Awakening, talks about this too. Is it now? The only thing I would say is I don't go as far. A lot of people like Mitchell and Douglas Murray and others talk about this as being caused by the decline of religion. Now, in the U.S., there's no question that there has been a recent decline of religion amongst young people, starting maybe in the 1990s, moving gradually to the present. But in Europe, that decline took place much earlier. I mean, it's still happening in Britain, for example, but it's not falling from such a high level. The U.S. has always been a much more religious society, and so we've always had these substitute religions. Marxism is a substitute religion. I mean, even to some degree, nationalism is a substitute religion. So you've had a number of these things going on since the early 19th century, and this is just the latest one. And it is, in fact, a sort of a mutation off of, it is left liberalism, and it's a mutation of left liberalism. So it is a particular form of left liberalism, which is this. And so I'd say, if you look actually at survey data and you what you can see is there's a lot of very religious people that are very woke, actually. And you can see that at the highest levels of the evangelical churches even. You have very woke evangelicals. Lot of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is a sort of traditional evangelical denomination in America, had this huge debate over critical race theory, and there were a significant number of them that were in favor. And not only that, of course, the mainline Protestants certainly are very woke, the Anglicans, the Episcopalians, and others. So I don't think that religion per se is a bulwark against woke, where it's not the same kind of bulwark that, say, patriotism or, if you are strongly patriotic American or British person, you are extremely unlikely to be woke. But if you are a very religious person, there's a significant chance you could still be woke and still believe in reparations and still believe in white guilt and all these other things. So I'm not as convinced that the decline of religion has a whole lot to do with it. Now, of course, it will for some people. They may have missed that spiritual aspect in their life, and so they will really feel a hole and go after. But I haven't seen any evidence that points directly to that. Now, having said all that, there's no question that this does fulfill a lot of needs that religion might have fulfilled. But I'm just saying that you can be religious and have those needs fulfilled spiritually and still be extremely woke. So there's no incompatibility there. Maybe between a very sort of strict textual literalist form of religion, maybe that is a bulwark against woke, but a lot of religion as it's practiced every day isn't, I would say.
Yeah. The woke ideology seems to be picking and mixing sort of strands from all sorts of different ideologies. So when I was reading your book, Taboo, it struck me that they were very keen on the sort of postmodernist idea that there is no such thing as the truth. There is my truth and your truth and everybody else's truth. But the postmodernism at the same time really was trying to sort of free people from sort of group identity, whilst on the woke side of the ideology, we see that my truth, the bit from the postmodernists, but they very much reject not belonging to a group. They see the belonging to a particular group as, again, very, very important. And like James Lindsay, for example, he tends to link, for example, woke to Marxism a lot. And again, I can see some of the bits that they've borrowed from the ideology, especially around sort of the cancellation, even though the cancellation sort of back then tends to be off you go to the gulag or off you go to the prison, rather than we will just take away your livelihood and job and things like that. What type of ideologies do they really draw on the most?
Yeah, this is a really key question, and we're seeing a division opening up in the literature between those who see it as a version of Marxism and those who see it as having another source, which is myself, for example. So it's not that I think there are two pathways. One is you have Marxists who give up on the working class and they pull out the cassette marked class and they plug in the cassette marked identity, which is race, gender, sexuality. But the same console, which is about oppressor versus oppressed, it's all about power, is in play. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. The problem is how much influence did those people who want to make revolution and overthrow capitalism and overthrow bourgeois society and the family and all this sort of thing, how important as a motive was that in getting us to where we are now? My view is it's actually not the most important thing that occurs. So this idea of revolutionary change and hatred and envy of the system, it's a component of it. And don't get me wrong, it is a component of it. The idea that they then replaced class with identity and engaged in a so-called war of position by trying to deliberately take over institutions and go engage in what Duchka calls a march through the institutions. I don't think that is the main story. I think that is part of the story, but I place more emphasis on what I would call an evolutionary liberal humanitarianism. And that liberal humanitarianism has really three components. It's not about overthrowing society. It's just about we want to be nicer to the unfortunate. We're extremely scared of anything called fascism or reaction that'll take us back to Jim Crow and women in the home and gays in the closet and Germany 1933. So you have an exaggerated catastrophism and alarmism about the cultural conservatives. You have this very humanitarian, empathetic approach to minorities, defined more initially in ethnic terms, but white ethnic terms, but later in terms of race and then gender and sexuality. And so it's majorities bad and scary, minorities warm and cuddly. That very basic emotional structure combined with guilt over the bad things we, quote unquote, we, however that's defined, did to them, quote unquote, in the past. So guilt, empathy, and alarmism. Not necessarily wanting to overthrow anything, but so the difference there is that the liberal humanitarians would say, well, we need more, we're too white, too male, we need more diversity, we need more inclusion. They say we need more diversity, more equity, more inclusion. They don't say, okay, this is the number we're shooting for. This would be a measure of where we've gone too far and we've got enough equity or we've got enough diversity. It's just an open-ended thing, unbounded, no guardrails. And so what happens is you actually get this liberal humanitarianism ratcheting and just pushing it to the next level, the next level, the next level every generation. That's not the same as wanting to make revolution, but it gets to the same place. Ultimately, we arrive in the same place. You have left liberal extremism. The be kind people, the bleeding heart liberal people get to the same place. And if you actually look at what is the DEI apparatus today, now, and just to make this clearer, I mentioned earlier that woke is the making sacred of historically marginalized groups. That gives rise to this ideology I call woke cultural socialism, which is about equal outcomes, let's say between black and white or men and women in any field of endeavor. Equal outcomes plus emotional harm protection is the ideology. DEI, equity, diversity is the same as equal outcomes. Inclusion is the same as emotional harm protection. So DEI is kind of a way of describing the ideology I'm talking about. And if you take DEI, the strands that are in DEI, a number of quite a few of them don't come from cultural Marxism. So affirmative action quotas, the idea of proportional representation by race, by gender, it doesn't come from cultural Marxism, from Marcuse or Angela Davis or Paulo Freire or any of these people. That is it comes through in the late 60s in the Johnson administration, in American courts. So you have affirmative action, speech codes. Again, that's not got a cultural Marxist origin. That's about, well, we've got to be inclusive and be nice to people. That's why we can't let you have your free speech. That's why we might have to cancel some people. So again, it's not coming out of this idea of wanting radical social transformation and to overthrow the oppressor. Now, of course, there is a cultural Marxist version of the argument that says, well, if we let whites and males and conservatives have free speech, then that is going to reinforce a structure of systemic inequality, whether racial, whether it's patriarchy, whatever. But that is a more intellectual argument, which I don't think is which I don't think that's the main driver. So what I talk about in the book is that this much more emotional, be kind kind of, and be scared, that kind of, and be guilty, that kind of attitude is why you see the cultural Marxist rhetoric. So there are some cultural Marxist strands as well now. Systemic racism, white privilege, patriarchy. These are cultural Marxist ideas, but they only work because they resonate with a much larger group of left liberals who are motivated by guilt, alarmism, and empathy towards these minority groups. And I put more emphasis on that process of liberal humanitarianism, which, by the way, also goes and influences psychotherapy, starting in the early 60s with Carl Rogers. And so we get this humanistic psychotherapy, and that's where these ideas around self-esteem, emotional safety, trauma, emotional bullying, and all these sorts of things come from. And that's where a lot of the speech code philosophy comes from, and this clamping down on free speech is through this humanistic psychotherapy, fragility, snowflake type of ideology. And so that's all this humanistic therapeutic ideology is not a Marxist. It doesn't have a Marxist root. And that's kind of why I sort of emphasize a lot in the book that, yes, there's no question that cultural Marxists do want to replicate themselves, do have a certain amount of power in universities and in arts councils and in other places. But they would get nowhere without the support of that big chunk of well-meaning left liberals. Why did a majority of Seattle citizens support defund the police? Is it because they want to overthrow the capitalist order and the family? No, it's basically because they were suckered in by the appeal to this kind of be kind philosophy, and so they went along with some really radical stuff. And I think we have to understand that liberal humanitarian substrate. That's why the soil is so fertile. And it's kind of anchored, all of this is anchored not in logic and in principles and in high intellectual ideas like postmodernism, but in stories about Jim Crow and slavery and the Holocaust. And it's all about stories of the good and the goodies and the baddies. And the cultural left has won the battle for hearts. It doesn't do well on a debate stage because it doesn't deal in fact and logic, but it does very well with meaning making, with movies, with books, with memes, and all sorts of sort of emotional things. And that's really the big driver here, is those sort of left liberal emotions focusing on guilt, focusing on empathy, focusing on fear.
I think hence the cancellations. Like the part of the reason why these ideologies cancel people so readily is because there are no debates there. When there are debates, you can very clearly see that they are at the losing side very, very quickly. And I think that's the reason why they keep going for the professors, for example, or, educated elites. Is because these are the people that are able to dismantle their arguments. But what I'm starting to see is that the cancellation, however horrible it is, it's not really successful anymore. Not as successful as it maybe was 20 years ago. I mean, look at you. You know, you were essentially cancelled. You went through a bit of the mobbing. Arguably, you know, you are probably doing better off now than where you were 5 years ago. Not that you would sort of voluntarily go through that, but I see the sort of the rise of the new media and the sort of alternative information universe to BBC and ITV News. Sort of it makes the cancellation a little bit less successful and efficient as it used to be.
Well, yeah, I think when you say I wouldn't say 20 years ago. I would say the peak of cancel culture was around 2020, 2021. So in the last 3 years, it's harder to cancel people now. Why is that? Now, if you look in Britain, for example, where, I had this experience when I was critical of the social justice move, so-called social justice movement. I got a lot of attacks from the radical students and staff who tried to gin up these Twitter mobs, and I had quite a few internal investigations prompted by these radicals. What I would say is that the press, certainly in Britain, it is quite difficult to find, even at The Guardian, actually, people who favor cancel culture. It's almost unheard of in the press. There are some, but very few will defend this practice. And so the radicals inside the institutions are relatively isolated from public opinion. And so what they kind of hope is that they can just operate in their little bubble with their social media acolytes and weaponizing the processes and procedures of universities. And of course, this is another aspect of it. Why this left liberal humanitarian thing is so important is those people have created the workplace policies, the HR policies inside organizations, which the radicals can then weaponize. This idea that, well, you have to be respectful, you have to sort of be inclusive, you have all of these sort of woolly, mushy words and you're always kind of respecting the subjective feelings of hurt of whoever claims to be hurt, and so this kind of, they're able to weaponize those policies. Now, what I would say about people being canceled is, I was able to survive it, although I think it definitely is extremely sort of nerve-wracking when you get that email saying you have to report to this and such a place. There's been a complaint put in against you. I mean, that's pretty powerful. And especially if you fear for your job. And in academia, if you lose your job, you're not getting back in. It's 150 applications for every post. Certainly not anywhere you want to work. So it's a very powerful, chilling effect that these accusations have. And now there have been some bodies like the Free Speech Union that has popped up, which has, done an excellent job. The main academic unions are completely woke in Britain, and they are on the side of your employer if there's any kind of a challenge to you over speech issues. So they are 100% useless. But what I should say is there are a number of people who don't have a public profile. Like I had a Twitter profile and I'd written in the press. If you don't have a profile, it's a bit like escape velocity, that if you shoot something out into space, if you get past a certain point, the Earth's gravity will slingshot you up into the stratosphere. If, however, you don't have enough escape velocity, you'll just fall back to Earth. And so there are many casualties who just either decided to shut up, or they were punished in different ways by getting worse teaching and research, or they were fired. A number of people you never heard of were just fired. So I would say that for the vast majority of dissenting academics, it's an effective strategy to shut them up or punish them. And so I wouldn't conclude from the few people who do actually manage to profit from, or at least to do well by telling their war stories. I don't think that's representative of the entire phenomenon. So I wouldn't want to lose sight of the fact that on balance, cancel culture does is effective in shutting people up and disciplining people. It takes a huge toll. I mean, the share of conservative academics who say they self-censor is around 3/4 in the English-speaking countries. So it's an enormously powerful silencer, really, of opinion.
I definitely wanted to cover that because I see that being used as a bit of the sort of defense of the cancellation culture, and saying that cancellation culture is just the healthy debate, which clearly it isn't. But it was brought on a few times in the sort of the mainstream media coverage and certain debates that were had. And like you say, just because you've got few bit more well-known names that managed to survive and actually do better, it gave them even more of the platform, I suppose. It gave them the PR that
Right.
that they didn't have before, perhaps. But a guy from ASDA that is lost his job because he liked a post on Facebook about something that that guy didn't get publicity. We know about the story, but we don't know his name. We don't know which ASDA it was. That it's, you really need to have that public work behind you. I think Douglas Murray put it really nicely, because they went after him recently quite ferociously. And he said that, it's very easy for him to weather it because he's got like 7 books behind him, thousands of articles. It's like you go through that and try and cancel him because he's got so much public appearance in terms of people know who he is.
Right. And if you're if you're not dependent on your institution as well, I mean, J.K. Rowling is uncancelable because she's wealthy and she has her own brand. She's not beholden to it. Now, her publishers can drop her, but then probably some publisher is going to go for her because they know they're going to do very well. And but yeah, so I think this is one of the games the left, it just refuses. The way the cultural left operates is it will essentially deny there's a problem until the evidence is so overwhelming, and then they'll just suddenly pretend they never denied there was a problem. And so it's quite interesting to see how it operates. It's like on the gender trans issue. Suddenly now the Labour Party in Britain is accepting the Cass review. Things that they accept now, which they would have called a right-wing plot a number of years ago. And they just memory hold the fact that they were foursquare against this stuff a number of years back and said trans women are women and that's it, no debate. All of this is suddenly, they pretend they didn't say it. I mean, and we're having this debate, of course, now in the U.S. election. Kamala Harris, who obviously was in favor of defund the police and is now trying to pretend that just never happened. Now, of course, on the debate stage, that's going to be thrust in her face, and that's a different story. But I just think but when it comes to kind of intellectuals, they will just, they won't actually change. If they change their minds, they'll suddenly pretend they never held different views. And the strategy for dealing with challenges, from those who are critical of the social justice movement is to just ignore. So they don't engage, they just simply ignore. So my book, for example, no one on the cultural left is going to review that. They will it's just radio silence. Like, okay, I'd be because I would be interested to get a hostile review from somebody to say, okay, we think the evidence is weak here, and this is our counter evidence, and this argument does, the conclusions don't flow from the premises, whatever. I would love to have some constructive engagement of that kind from the left. They just will not touch any of these books. They just pretend they don't exist. That's their argument.
Putting a review for your book taboo would imply that they've read the book, and even that would be probably enough to get them cancelled between their, in their social circle. But we've been basically going around the political ideologies and how they shifted. And I mean, I've been observing what's been going on for a very, very long time. I wasn't particularly political for a big chunk of my life, but then seeing just how many tools and strategies are being borrowed from communist countries and Soviet Union by current governments. It's just too obvious to sort of to ignore what is going on in our politics, because we've got the left that no longer gives a damn about the working class. They openly detest them. We've got the conservatives that would struggle to pass for a wet lettuce liberal most of the time. They stand for nothing. We've got the liberals that are pushovers by the left. They, again, can't really... The liberals seem to struggle to sort of say, okay, enough now. We've been kind enough. Like, they kind of keep just drifting.
Right.
So we've got, within all of the major strands of political thought, we've got major changes to the point where they are not really recognizable. And the economics for each of these parties, it's like, oh, forget about that. Let's just focus on the culture stuff. Like, am I the only one that is looking at it thinking, this is absolute insanity? Like, what are you guys doing? So, what the hell is going on in politics right now?
Well, it's interesting because it reminds me of I live in a constituency that was being fought over between the Lib Dems and Labour. I mean, it's actually a three-way split between Tory, Lib Dem, and Labour, and we had, basically people knocking on the door all the time, and we had a sort of quite well-known. There's quite a well-known Lib Dem politician, and whose name is escaping me now. I'm trying to remember. And I basically said, what is the difference between the Lib Dems and Labour policy-wise? I don't really understand it. And he said, and he couldn't give me an answer. And I think that sort of speaks to your point, that really there is very little difference between the Lib Dems and Labour. Now, Labour is basically they're both what I would call progressive neoliberal parties, that is economically they're kind of market-based centrists, and culturally they're woke leftists. And that's true of both the Lib Dems and Labour. And so, what's happened really more broadly is you've had a realignment. And to some extent, so culturally, we had this realignment culturally and politically, where the left, it used to be that economic left-right was where you positioned yourself, and the working class were more voting for Labour or left-wing or the Democrats, and the middle class or upper middle were voting for the right. That is now completely gone, almost completely gone. You have the same class composition in parties of the left and right, between Republicans, Democrats, Labour, Tory. There's no real difference in terms of the class of who votes for those parties. But what has changed instead is that you now have a differentiation on the cultural axis between what we might call globalist nationalist, or flatteringly open versus closed, although I think that's not the right characterization. But you have a sort of cultural conservatives against, cultural left liberal. That is really the way people decide on which party to vote for, in terms of the correlations. And so this realignment from economics to culture now suddenly means you've got a Labour Party that is really representing a relatively well-off, highly educated, but culturally left-wing group. And you have the Tories representing a culturally conservative, regardless of class. So there's a lot of working class voters there, until this election defeat, of course. And where does the left go? If you look at Labour's manifesto, the number of references to race and gender vastly dwarfs the number of references to class. So it is definitely oriented around the woke totems, race, gender, sexuality. That's really what the Labour activists are fired up by. And even though Starmer has had to try and keep that quiet, because it's actually quite unpopular. I mean, if we look at public opinion is about 2-1 against the woke position, whether on gender, on race, on free speech. The woke position is very unpopular in the country. So Labour will try and downplay it. But if you take their activists, that is what's firing them up. And you can see now, Labour's concessions. They can't deliver on the economy. It's very difficult. There's a lot of moving parts and constraints that are outside their control. But what they can do is, for example, they halted the implementation of the Academic Freedom Act. And the Free Speech Union are taking them to court. We'll see what comes of that. But that was a sop to the UCU, the public sector unions and the woke leadership and activists. They're trying to do this whole online harms stuff, which is about cracking down on conservative speech. Maybe they'll crack down on GB News. Who knows? But this whole hate speech disinformation stuff is a big crusade of the woke anti-free speech left, and they're leaning into that. They're going to do something on as if there isn't enough brainwashing going on in the schools, but they want to even ramp it up even more. They're definitely rewarding. They're tossing red meat to their woke shock troops, and really, because a lot of the other thing to say is that a lot of the culture war stuff, a lot of average voters have not been mobilized on these issues that much. Those issues still rank relatively low for a lot of voters. They don't quite understand, even they kind of get the trans issue, but until it's like with the Isla Bryson thing in Scotland, until you actually put a picture of a tattooed male rapist going into a woman's prison splashed all over the papers, the electorate was allowing Nicola Sturgeon to sort of push through all this stuff about, gender recognition certificates at age 16. And all of these sorts of things were going under the radar and would have passed if it hadn't have been for this particular story blowing up. And this kind of gets to a point, which is that these are very unpopular ideas, but a lot of people don't quite understand what's happening inside institutions. And until the conservative side starts unearthing and splashing these images up on the screen and making a big issue of it, that nothing really is going to change very much. And of course, the conservatives, as you say, in Britain certainly are extremely wet. So they kind of are rule takers from the left when it comes to cultural questions. They push back selectively. So they did push back a bit on statue toppling. There were some speeches around by Kemi Badenoch on critical race theory, but the actual implementation was very weak of guidance on what is indoctrination and what is political in schools. Extremely flabby guidance from Nadim Zahawi. And so, the teachers just laughed and can drive a truck through that, through the loopholes. So, they weren't really serious. Now, in the US, you see much more serious the red state politicians at the state level, like Ron DeSantis in particular, much more follow through, much more stamina. And they're having an impact on schools. They're having an impact on the culture of DEI in government. That is what's needed. But it's going to take a different kind of conservative party that is much more focused on culture and not just playing in the nice, safe sandbox called economics that the left will allow them to play in. And that is going to mean politicians being willing to be called racist, sexist, homophobe, stoking the culture, all that stuff. They need to be doing that in order to be effective, but that's going to take a certain amount of stomach, which the Tories have not hitherto had in this country. And in the US, I would say there are also other priorities. The right has been focused on various other things, the economy, foreign policy, and perhaps, even other bits of domestic policy. They haven't actually been focused enough. Part of the reason for that is because, if you take the US case, you have very powerful lobbies on the abortion issue, very powerful lobbies on tax, on guns, you have lobbies in certain areas. And so the Republican Party has responded and by delivering policy in those areas, but there isn't a powerful lobby to repeal affirmative action. And so, all those Republican states, the Republican ones could have just repealed affirmative action easily. They didn't do it. 4 of them did it. That's an issue that 2/3 of Americans would be with them on. Whereas the abortion bans, it's only a 1/3 issue. And even in the red states, it may be only a marginal, maybe 50%, maybe under 50% of support. So it's kind of, but it shows you that without the lobby groups, without the organization on critical race theory, on affirmative action, on these culture war issues, that won't be seen as a priority by the mainstream right party.
I think throughout your work, you hinted on the fact that the electorate sort of knows where the politics and the culture sort of politics needs to be. It's the system that we've built that isn't actually delivering on that. And you've hinted on the fact that the change will really come from electing political parties that are actually able to fix the institutions. So, for example, in the UK, we know that we've got a very big problem within, for example, Home Office, in terms of very partisan decision making, not implementing the policies that they class as not moral enough. But I see a problem within conservatism as such to actually address it. We have moved so far to the left currently in a lot of the issues that a lot of people want to actually see some very, very decisive action that to a lot of conservatives, it will feel a little bit too revolutionary. The conservatives, as you were talking about them in some of your work, they don't really want revolution. They want gradual changes. But right now, we've drifted so far to the left that for a lot of people, the only change that will actually feel meaningful is something a little bit more revolutionary, something a little bit more radical. Let's use that word. How do you see the potential of conservatives, or for example, let's call them right-leaning parties, to actually deliver on just getting us back to some sort of center?
Yeah, I mean, you touch on so many important things. I mean, one has been the capture of the institutions by the cultural left. Now, that's partly because it's for a number of reasons. I mean, one is that the sort of nature of public morality is very much structured around the idea of equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for minority groups. That is really the public morality of our time. And so the terrain that you're battling on is very slanted in favor of the cultural left, even if they didn't have the numbers. But of course, they increasingly do have the numbers inside institutions, because the leading edge of the culture has been towards the cultural left, cultural left liberalism. And so young people, young professionals, increasingly slant in that direction, not just academics and journalists, but also, or artists, but also increasingly lawyers and medics and people go into government. So you now have this essentially very left-leaning bureaucracy. With not only that, they've also got the Equality Act and various pieces of legislation they can use to justify reinforcing the kind of woke tone within these institutions. What's needed is essentially a period of politicization, actually, political appointees. We have to, elected government, the executives of elected governments are that's really the only institution that the majority of the public can control. We've got to use those elected administrations to break into the institutions and actually to remove their abilities, their power, to take their power away, power over cultural matters, over ethos, over indoctrination. That's got to be removed. And that's as true for schools as it is for universities, as it is for bureaucracies. Now, that's not to say government should be controlling what is taught in universities. No, universities have to have the freedom to teach, to teach the curriculum they want to teach. What I would say, however, is that there's definitely a role for government here. This idea that there is a version of what I would call liberal conservatism, or an older libertarian tradition that thinks, oh, you want to shrink government and devolve everything as much as possible. That is the exact opposite of what needs to happen, because the more you devolve power, the more power goes into bodies that are not scrutinized by the press, that are really open to people who are the most politically energetic, which is the left. So they will capture anything that is devolved. The only way to fight back in this battle is to centralize power back into the executive, which is scrutinized, which is elected. That executive then tells those devolved bodies what to do, and that you're not going to censor, You're not going to implement critical race theory and DEI. You're not going to push whatever policies you want to push. You will obey the policies that the electorate has voted for. In order to do that, you actually need a conservative administration that really starts to follow a lot of the precepts. So the model for this, in a way, is the Federalist Society in the United States, which has organized chapters across universities and funnels talent, conservatively aligned talent, into the judiciary. So clerking for Supreme Court justices, for court appointment of circuit judges at all levels of the judiciary. And what that means is, even though the students at the law schools lean 10-1 to the left, the 1 out of 10 that are on the right are mined very intensively. And in fact, your chance of becoming and clerking for a Supreme Court justice is, or for I think any of the top level court justices, is something like 12 or 14 times higher if you're conservative. The way that's done is the Federalist Societies vet candidates. And so you have this whole system of vetting and channeling and careers that are set up by the Federalist Society. We need that for the bureaucracy as well, so that you can get conservative candidates placed in top bureaucratic positions, and you have a Rolodex file of people who are aligned. That's starting to happen in the US with this Project 2025 that Heritage Foundation is working on. This idea is you have to be very strategic. You have to essentially penetrate the bureaucracy with political appointments, and with enough staff who understand the law so that they can push back when civil servants say this can't be done because of that law. Somebody who knows the law and says, sorry, that's wrong, we're doing it. And if you don't like it, you can leave. And maybe even firing people to make an example. I actually think it's quite possible to reform these institutions with a determined and unified and focused conservative movement. Similarly with the schools, I think it's possible to outpace the educational establishment, and you're starting to see the impact of the critical race theory bans in American public schools in the red states, and it is working. And I think the same with the DEI bans in the university systems. All of this stuff can be done with stamina, with patience, attention to detail, and personnel. It's going to take mobilization and organization. The US is definitely furthest out in front on this. I think other countries like Britain, Canada should be looking to how they're doing it as a way. So I'm saying that I think we have plenty of tools within liberal democracy to actually start to push back and make the institutions reflect the public opinion, which is not woke. Now, the other thing I should say is, I mentioned young people are becoming more woke. But so the other part of this, one part of it is short-term and this political quote-unquote invasion of the institutions. But the other part of this is a longer-term, the battle of ideas, which is a longer-term game. And there, I think it's happening in places like this. It's happening online. Online is having an impact now. I'm more and more convinced the new media and the online, the podcasts, the YouTube channels, they're all having an impact. You can see it among younger people in particular who aren't watching mainstream media. And there is a significant anti-woke component amongst young people. And I think that's coming online. I don't think it's definitely not coming from schools and universities. It's so yeah.
Definitely not coming from BBC either.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, you've been very, very generous with your time. I could talk to you for another 2 hours, but for people that want to find out about your work, I would very highly recommend your book, the latest book, which is The Taboo in the UK and The Great Awakening. Is it in the States?
The third Awakening is the US and Canada title. Anywhere else, it's Taboo. So yeah, I mean, please do check it out. And also, I've got my new open online course on woke at the University of Buckingham. Anyone in the world can take that. And then I should also mention briefly my new Center for Heterodox Social Science at the university. And, Buckingham is the only free speech university out of 181 institutions in Britain at the leadership level, not necessarily the academics and students, but at the leadership level. And so it is the place where, if we're going to create an alternative knowledge production system that is faithful to the facts, where you can go where the truth leads without having to worry about red lines and taboos, this is going to happen here. And so what we're trying to do is we want to investigate all of the questions and perspectives that are considered out of bounds, or at least that are career limiting right now in the academy. And that's a lot of, so imagine a ski hill. You're allowed to ski on this narrow piste. All the areas off piste, you're not allowed to go, and that's where we're going to try and go.
Yeah, I mean, I can highly recommend the book and the course. They are excellent, and I mean, I must say, I've been following you for a very long time, but I've been delving into your work way more deeply in the last couple of months and weeks, and you have been my intellectual crush recently. And
I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you.
Absolutely. And the one thing that I can say is I am currently quite pessimistic about where we are going in the UK, with the latest government and sort of the direction where they are choosing to go in the last 8 weeks in particular. I think that we are in for a bit difficult sort of 10 years. But what I find in your work is I always see the glimmer of hope. And your work in particular with the university, I mean, you have got a course on woke in university. Like that just 18 months ago, 2 years ago, would be seemingly impossible. So there are these glimmers of hope that I really pick from your work. So highly recommend for you guys to go and check out Eric's work. And then in terms of where can people find you online?
Well, yeah, I mean, the easiest on my Twitter, it's at EPKAUFM. That's my Twitter handle. And my website, where all my talks and articles and everything is just sneps.net, SNEPS.net. So, yeah, I look forward to you stopping by.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Eric Kaufmann.
Thank you, Kat. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to Wisdom Rebellion. Before you go, if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider subscribing. It massively helps with keeping the show on the road so we can all build a wiser world together. And if you loved this video, you will also love this one. I'll see you there.